It's my pleasure to welcome you all here today for this Tower Center monthly seminar. My name is Jim Hollifield, and I'm the director of the center. Many of you may think of my colleague Josh Robiner as the director of the center. He served as the interim director last year, and now back in his role as director of studies, in charge of programming. But while I was away in Washington, D.C., working at the Wilson Center, they must have had a great coup in marketing or something to get a turnout like this. And one of my colleagues here said, we need a bigger room, and I said either a bigger room or less popular speakers, I guess. What he says, there's a place over here, and I think we're bringing one more chair in here, so chair in the corner here. They brought you a chair. They brought you a chair. It is really a pleasure for me to introduce my colleague Josh Robiner, who is the John Goodwin Tower Distinguished Chair of International Politics and National Security, Professor of Political Science, and he's taught at a number of places, holds a PhD from MIT. When we were hiring Josh, he had on his CV that he chaired seminar number 53 or something like that, and I remember asking him what was seminar number 53 at MIT, and he said, "I'm sorry, I cannot tell you about seminar number 53, or I would have to kill you." So he has been very involved in the study of intelligence. He wrote a prize-winning book called Fixing the Facts, so he knows a lot about this topic. I'm not going to spend any more time, so get to the program, so please join me in welcoming my colleague, Josh Robiner.
Thanks everybody for coming. Welcome back to the Tower Center for, I guess, our first program of the fall semester. As is customary, when you return from summer vacation, the first conversation is, what did you do over your summer vacation? And here's what I did. I said, I want to go to England. Let's get away. I thought, where can I go to escape the madness of the U.S. presidential election and all of the heat of that campaign that's still ongoing? I said, I'll go somewhere sedate, somewhere calm, somewhere easygoing. I'll go to England. So I go, and within a week, the British public have voted to leave the European Union, and the government has collapsed. So that was surprising. And another thing happened. Within 2 weeks, there was the release of what's called the Chilcot Inquiry Report, which is a massive government post-mortem inquiry on intelligence and foreign policy and military decision-making before, during, and after the Iraq War of 2003. This was a huge deal in Great Britain. This report took 7 years to complete. It came in at a staggering 2.6 million words. It's a monster of a report. And so I admit I haven't read it all. There are some sections which I haven't yet got to, but I've read a good chunk of it, and I'll be speaking about that today. Trying to figure out what it means, what it tells us about intelligence, what, if anything, we learn new about the Iraq War, and what this says about the future of intelligence in a democracy. So while I was vacationing in England, I took this picture. Does anybody recognize the building? A couple of people are nodding their head. MI6 headquarters. This is the Secret Intelligence Service, the famous building on the Thames, which houses Great Britain's sort of legendary intelligence service. And beautiful sunny day, got this great picture of it. I want you to imagine that you're in charge of this building. I want you to, for the purpose of our conversation today, imagine that you are running SIS. You are in charge of this building and everybody in it. And it's early 2002, perhaps a year before the war in Iraq begins. The war in Afghanistan has already gone off. It's already gone pretty well. The Taliban has been toppled. And now all of a sudden the conversation has shifted to Iraq. Is Iraq the next target of American and perhaps British military force? Right? Well, if you're running this building, if you're an intelligence chief, you have a number of big problems that you have to deal with. The first is collection. You have to learn how to collect intelligence on one of the hardest problems there is. You can take this seat too. It's a stand. Think about the problem of collection. Right? The task for intelligence is to ferret out information from Iraq about its unconventional weapons programs, its nuclear programs, its biological weapons, its chemical weapons programs as well. This is inherently difficult to do. Right? It's inherently difficult because this is probably the most closely guarded secret that Iraq had. Finding intelligence and reliable intelligence on what another country is doing with so-called weapons of mass destruction is just inherently hard to do. Collection is always going to be hard. Now you can use sort of technologically exotic collection platforms, things like imagery satellites, things like signals intelligence collection platforms, but that's not going to get you everything you need. What you really need is human intelligence. You need assets on the ground who can report at high levels what Iraq is up to. What are their capabilities with these weapons, and what are their intentions? Will they build more of them? Will they use them? And if so, when and how? Very difficult to do. The problem for the people running British intelligence is they had very little assets on the ground. They had almost nobody in place that could report on what was going on. So the picture was inherently murky. There wasn't anybody there reporting back. The collection problem was compounded by the scale of the problem. Iraq is a big country. Right? Iraq is just enormous. And in the 1980s, it had sprawling chemical programs. Here's a map of some of the key locations from the chemical program in the 1980s. Biological programs. Here's a sort of shocking CIA slide from 2004 in the Delfa report. Different biological sites and nuclear sites as well. Iraq in the 1980s had an unsuccessful but large-scale nuclear research effort. Right? So if you're trying to get at the heart of what Iraq possessed in 2002, you faced a really hard challenge. You faced an inherently difficult collection problem with no assets on the ground, and knowledge that in the 1980s there was this huge and sprawling research and development effort. Your collection problem was really tricky. Right? Well, if you don't have a lot of information from the ground, then you have to do a lot of analysis. You have to try to guesstimate to the best of your ability what's going on in Iraq without the benefit of a lot of hard data. And so this brings you to the second problem faced by the British intelligence chiefs at the time, the problem of analysis. Right? How do you come to conclusions? How do you deliver the kind of analysis that's actually useful to a policymaker at the time with partial information? Now, this is a problem that has long bedeviled intelligence services worldwide. The problem of analysis, the problem of getting past a number of very familiar biases and barriers to effective intelligence work. Perhaps the best known bias, the best known barrier to accuracy is psychological, the human brain. The human brain is a wonderful, magical thing, and it's also prone to making a lot of mistakes. Human beings, I'll give you one mistake, and this will loom large in this story. Human beings love patterns. We are hardwired to find patterns in the data. We need to do this to exist. All of us, all the time, are bombarded with information. Even right now, sitting in your chair, or standing as it were, you're receiving millions of pieces of data. You don't even know it. Right? Not just the sound of me yammering on, but the feel of the seat underneath you, the temperature of the air, ambient sounds like people eating chips. Right? There's lots of information that's going on. Right? Please don't stop. There's lots of information that you're receiving. You're not even thinking about it. Most of the time you don't even think about it because the brain is programmed to just recognize the pattern. Every time you hear somebody crunching a chip, you don't have to start from scratch and say, oh my God, what does that mean? Right? You know what it means. You expect it. You see the pattern in the data. We all work this way. And it's very useful for human beings, but it's a problem for intelligence analysts. Right? Because if you're an intelligence analyst, what you're supposed to do is look for deviations from patterns. You're supposed to look for dissonant information, things that don't fit. right? Things that you're not expecting. And when those and when you see those deviations, then you have to report on them. Well, unfortunately, this can be a problem. But even intelligence analysts who are aware of the danger of not seeing differences fall victim to this problem. This explanation was really important for the Chilcot Committee, because what intelligence analysts did in the absence of hard data about Iraqi capabilities is they reverted to beliefs about Saddam Hussein, right? Beliefs about Saddam Hussein and what he represented. Here's an old picture of Saddam from 1975. The guy on the left there with the suit, right? Looks like a statesman. This is sort of the old view of Saddam Hussein in the 1970s. He's not a nice man. He's actually sort of a ruthless and horrible man. But the sort of predominant view of him was that he's somebody that you can work with. He's a statesman. He's reliable, however ruthless he is. And here he is conducting diplomacy with the Shah of Iran, president of Algeria at the time. This was the prevailing view. Well, after the Persian Gulf War in 1991, this view changed. The image of Saddam Hussein changed from sort of a reliable, dubious statesman to this guy. Just another dictator. Just another guy with a pistol, a military uniform, and a mustache. Just another ruthless aggressor who would run tank divisions across borders, conquer territory, torture, and kill people in large numbers. This was the image of Saddam Hussein, which dominated the analytical community after 1991. And not only was he a terrible, aggressive dictator in the mold of Hitler and Stalin, but he was also a great deceiver. Saddam Hussein got a reputation for being a serial liar. He lied about everything. You couldn't believe a word he said. He was active in the arts of concealment and deception. This is what he was all about. For the Chilcot Inquiry, this was key. What they're finding is that British intelligence analysts and policymakers alike fell victim to believing that Saddam Hussein was this guy, and therefore Iraq must have these banned weapons, biological, chemical, nuclear weapons. His protests to the contrary went nowhere because they all assumed he was lying. And this deeply held belief stopped intelligence analysts from going back and saying, well, maybe there's another explanation. Why aren't we seeing any evidence of these weapons? Why aren't we seeing any actual proof that he possesses all this bad stuff? Well, their action was, well, he must be hiding it. He must be deceiving us in some way. This, after all, is Saddam Hussein. That guy. Well, suppose, as a counterfactual, that British intelligence had done better. Suppose that they had overcome the problems of collection and the problems of analysis and delivered an excellent and accurate and reliable summary of Iraq's weapons programs in 2002. Right? Suppose, just pretend, play a what-if game, they had delivered the perfect estimate, right? Timely, reliable, accurate, and relevant to policymakers' needs. They still wouldn't have been done. They still would not have been done. Because if you don't have a consumer at the other end which is willing to take you seriously, if you don't have a policymaker who is willing to read and listen to your analysis, then you are nowhere. Enter Tony Blair. Enter the other major figure in this story. The intelligence community in Great Britain was working for Tony Blair and was trying to help him make the case for more aggressive actions towards Iraq in 2002. Up until 2002, the essence of British intelligence on Iraq had gone a little bit like this. We assumed that they are up to no good. We assume that some of those 1980 programs are still sort of lingering out there somewhere. We don't think Iraq has a big or imminent capability. And most of all, we don't know a whole lot at all. We don't have a lot of good information. We don't have a lot of hard detail. So take everything we say with a grain of salt. Right? This all changes in 2002. Right? British intelligence, especially over the summer of 2002, gets much more ominous. The tone and the content of its intelligence estimates ratchets up. Iraq seems to be more and more of an imminent threat and not some distant, abstract danger. This happens as 2002 goes along. The reason that I argue, and here's where I differ from the Chilcot inquiry, is that this had everything to do with Blair's relationship with his intelligence chiefs. And it really had little to do with these analytical biases which Chilcot focuses on. What happened was early in 2002, earlier than we had actually thought, it seems that Blair had decided on regime change. In early 2002, perhaps even late 2001, he had decided that Great Britain was going to go along if the United States chose this route, and he had good reason to believe that the U.S. would do this. Blair also knew, being a political animal, that he was going to have a very tough domestic fight. This was not going to be popular with the British people, this was not going to be popular in Parliament, and so he was going to have to move heaven and earth to overcome all of this domestic skepticism before he could convince the country to go to war in Iraq. Well, Blair also, I think, realized the power of intelligence as a public relations vehicle. Intelligence agencies are incredibly persuasive if you're looking to make a case about foreign policy. The reason that intelligence agencies are very persuasive public relations vehicles is they control secrets. Secrets are seductive. Secrecy makes us believe in things, even things we ought not believe in. If we believe that somebody possesses secret knowledge, we take her more seriously than we should. And there's a lot of really interesting recent psychological research on this. I'll give you the shorthand version of the research. What people have done is they've separated groups into two halves. Each half gets the same intelligence document, just some made-up intelligence document. This half of the room receives no security markings, nothing suggesting that the document is classified. This half of the room gets the same document, but it's stamped secret all over it. And then they ask the two groups, which one do you believe? On a scale of 1 to 10, how reliable is this assessment? And the group on the left with no security markings says, about a 5. And the group on the right says, about 8, 9. They believe it because it's secret. For policymakers seeking to overcome domestic opposition, this can be really, really valuable. And policymakers, including Prime Minister Blair, used this in 2002, facing serious criticism in Parliament and from the public. Prime Minister Blair said, I have intelligence which shows that Saddam Hussein in Iraq is an imminent threat because of the possession of these weapons. Trust me. People said, we don't trust you. He said, well, trust my Joint Intelligence Committee. Trust the pros with the secrets. And in September of 2002, the British government took the unprecedented step of releasing a government dossier on Iraq's weapons of mass destruction, which was written by the Joint Intelligence Committee, which organizes all of the intelligence agencies in British government, but critically with a lot of input from the Blair government itself and the Blair Communications Office. Among other things, the Chilcot inquiry goes into great and gory detail about all of the conversations that went on between the political wing of 10 Downing Street and the intelligence officers who were charged with compiling this dossier and writing up the case against Saddam Hussein. We have their email correspondence. We have their meeting minutes. We know what the conversations were. And it's quite clear that the government was enlisting British intelligence to exaggerate the case, or at least to put it as stark terms as it possibly could. Now, this had serious implications for the quality of intelligence before the war. One implication was that the final product was terribly flawed. This document does not reflect well on British intelligence, the dossier that released in September 2002. Its overall judgments of Iraq were dead wrong. We know that now. We've known that for a long time. Iraq didn't have these weapons. It didn't have these stockpiles of biological or chemical agents. Moreover, it reveals that the practices that British intelligence normally took were shortcutted in this case. The mad rush to make this case led intelligence to take serious and terrible analytical shortcuts, which really affected the quality of the product. I'll give you one example. I said that there were no assets in the country that British intelligence could rely on. Well, on August 30th, this is August 30th, 2002, British intelligence, SIS, receives a report suggesting that Iraq was planning to perhaps deploy and even use biological weapons within 45 minutes of the order to do so. This was a shocking piece of news. The idea that Iraq had biological weapons, that it could use them within 45 minutes of Saddam saying go, this was incredibly fearful stuff. And it happened to be playing right into the case that Prime Minister Blair was trying to make in public. Now, typically, when British intelligence gets this kind of new information, it sends it to its experts in the Defense Intelligence Service. These are technical specialists. These are men and women who actually know what a biological weapon is, how you use it, what it takes to deploy it, and so forth. This is standard practice. In this case, they were ignored completely. They weren't even sent the information. Right? The government did a total roundabout. And in the 3 weeks between the arrival of this piece of information and the public release of the dossier, this one piece of raw, uncorroborated hearsay, which had never gotten any scrutiny from technical experts, found its way into the government's case for war and was splashed all over news headlines the very next morning. The Blair government knew very well that this would be something that newspaper editors would jump right on, and they did. This had terrible effects on not only the production of intelligence, but the quality of intelligence. As soon as it was enlisted in the public relations effort, it was almost inevitable that the quality of intelligence would decline, and surely did. A second effect of this was that information got better in early 2003. A funny thing happened in 2003. UN inspectors returned to the country. Sometimes people forget this now. But in December 2002, all the way up until just before the war in March 2003, inspectors returned. Weapons inspectors from the UN, the IAEA, returned, and they scoured the place. They were looking all over the country. Right? And they were bringing very sophisticated technologies, things like ground-penetrating radars so that they could look into supposed bunkers where the bad stuff might be held. They were finding a whole lot of nothing. Right? Estimates were something like 900 sites were visited during this time period, and the inspectors were turning up nothing. The head of the UN effort, Hans Blix, said, we're turning up nothing. The head of the IAEA, Mohammed Al-Baradei, was saying on the verge of the war, we're not seeing what we think we should be seeing. Right? Now, in normal circumstances, you would think this would at least lead to some reflection. Right? This is not proof positive that Iraq is innocent or that Saddam is off the hook. But gosh, maybe our very certain conclusions about Iraqi capabilities were wide of the mark. No such reassessment happened. No such reassessment happened. It didn't happen in the United States, and it did not happen in the United Kingdom. Right? Now, the Chilcot Inquiry thinks about this problem and asks, why was there no reassessment? And again, its basic conclusion was that the beliefs about Iraq were so entrenched at this point, right? That all of those human brains in the analytical community were so sure of Iraqi guilt that nobody was willing to see an alternative explanation, or they couldn't even see or imagine an alternative explanation. But I don't think that's right. In fact, I know there were some in the British intelligence community and the American intelligence community that were very skeptical, but their voices were not heard. I think what really happened in Britain, as in the United States, was that the publication of this document, and there was an American equivalent, gave the British intelligence communities a serious disincentive from going back and checking its own work. You don't want to go grade your past assessments if it's been done in public. To do so would have been a terribly embarrassing admission of past failure. And no intelligence official wanted to do that. That would be tragic from an organizational point of view. They weren't going to go back. And the Chilcot Inquiry, I think, buys this as well, even though they wouldn't say so in the report. There's a very telling section in the report where they talk about British assessments in summer and late 2003. This is after the war, after the inspectors have returned and it's clear that there was nothing there. And Chilcot says, well, the British government didn't really want to come back because that would have been embarrassing. Well, if it was going to be embarrassing in late 2003, it's going to be embarrassing in early 2003. Once these things were public, nobody wanted to do any sort of reassessment. So the cumulative effect of bringing intelligence in public in this way was that intelligence was wrong, and that nobody was willing to go back and check up on it later, even after better information came in. So this is not exactly a new story. There's not a lot in the Chilcot Inquiry that we didn't know already, though the detail is a lot, is very good. It'll be very useful for historians and analysts over time. It'll be very useful for people in the intelligence community and the policy community as they do their own postmortems and they think about what went wrong. I think that there are a couple of implications that we ought to think about. One is that it doesn't make any sense to view intelligence failure, as people often do, as something that stands on its own. We often look at intelligence and we say, why did the CIA fail? Or why did intelligence fail before 9/11? Or why did intelligence fail in the Iraq War? It doesn't make any sense to me. Intelligence is a part of the policy community. And instead of asking, why does intelligence fail, you might ask, why do you have these intelligence policy breakdowns? Where what should be a healthy relationship with intelligence and policy fails utterly, as it did in this case. A second and more difficult thing for us to think about is the relationship between secret intelligence and a democracy. This is really tricky. The story of Iraq is the story not just of Tony Blair calling for intelligence to be made public, but the story of a lot of people calling for intelligence to be made public. Legislators, parliamentarians, people in the public, newspaper editors. There was a lot of pressure on Tony Blair and President Bush to show us the evidence, right? Show us the intelligence. You want us to support this war? Show us the war. So it wasn't just craven politicians using intelligence and abusing it for their own purposes. There was a lot of pressure from everybody to make intelligence more transparent. The perverse outcome of this was that we all got dumber as a result. Because everybody is calling for secret intelligence to be made public, policymakers suddenly had a large incentive to make sure that intelligence said the right thing. Thus, instead of getting a fuller and more accurate view of what was going on in Iraq, we got a biased view, which was driven by political necessity, not by actual knowledge within the intelligence community. Bringing secret intelligence into the public debate has this effect, and I can talk about past cases historically if you want to as well. This is a pattern. Bringing secret intelligence into the public view has really perverse and weird consequences. But, this should make you uncomfortable because we live in a democracy, right? We live in a system of government which requires transparency and accountability. And if we allow some parts of the government to remain secret, remain shielded from this kind of public scrutiny and accountability, we're sort of violating our own norms and our own core values about what good governance means. I don't have a solution to that. I think that this is a trade-off which is built into built into our system and any democratic system. Right? If you want good intelligence, and if you want healthy, candid relations between intelligence officers and their political masters, secrecy is essential. Right? You have to be willing to accept the fact that if you bring intelligence into the public, you're going to end up with not only a worse intelligence product, which doesn't serve policymakers well, but also misguides the public and misguides the legislature about what's actually going on. All this brings me back to Vauxhall Cross, MI6. This is a very new building. British intelligence has been around forever, right? This building wasn't opened until 1994. 1994 happened to be the first year that the SIS or MI6 was put under statutory law in Great Britain. The British government didn't even publicly acknowledge the existence of an intelligence community until 1989 and didn't put it under statutory law until 1994, the same year that this building was opened. In the decade between 1994 and 2003, there was a huge move in Great Britain for more transparency. Bring the world of secrets out into the light. Expose agencies like MI6 and MI5 to public scrutiny, the way we expose all our other government agencies to scrutiny. This will be all for the good. The idea of secret intelligence, spies running around, getting up to no good, James Bond stuff, that's an anachronism. We are past that time. We are past the Cold War. It's time to bring these agencies into the light. Well, look where it got them. Within a decade, Britain had suffered the worst intelligence policy disaster in its history, right? And now, 13 years after that disaster, they are still facing huge public recriminations for it. Right? There have been many efforts to try to reform the process of intelligence and the process of intelligence policy relations to prevent this sort of thing from happening again, but perhaps the only one to do so with any confidence is to make intelligence secret again. And I'll stop there.
Thank you. I apologize for the packed house, but not much to be done. There's still a few lunches over here. Stick around and get one. But I know no one has any questions about it. But I already see my friend Pat Patterson has her hand up, my colleague Jeff Engel, and we'll just go around the room. And you want to collect a few questions, or we've got so many? Let's just take three at a time. Pat, here first.
Josh, thank you. That was an excellent presentation. I really understand it better than I ever have. What about the CIA and the policymakers on this side? Because that was a conversation that was ongoing and very intense. And I feel like we're getting one part of it, but we're not seeing the part that perhaps is closer to us here.
Make a note of that one.
Yep.
Go to Harold and then Jeffrey. Harold.
Yeah, I was really interested in your commentary about secrecy as a heuristic. But there was another big heuristic, of course, in the Iraq War for the British public, and that was the civilian casualties that were occurring. And one of the things we've done we do a lot of work over there, is that this has a really strong correlation with declining support for Prime Minister Blair. And it happens pretty fast. And so, I mean, this is just sort of an add-on. It's, the heuristics are really important. In the British case, unlike the American, of course, Great Britain lost very few soldiers, 150 or something like this. And we deliberately put them where they'd be out of harm's way, or former President Bush did. But nevertheless, the British public did have a heuristic there. And I just wondered if you'd comment on that, because one of the things about the Iraq War, it's been massively unpopular in Britain, as you said, but for a long time.
Let's go to Jeffrey, and then we'll let you respond and get your questions ready. I'm going to just keep coming around the room that way, okay? And I know there are quite a few. Jeffrey.
I'm curious if there's anything that the intelligence community in Britain or the United States could have said that would have precluded the decision to go to war.
That's a tough one. Do you want to answer those, and then we'll try another round?
So, first for Pat, what about the CIA experience, and what about the U.S. experience during this time? It was almost exactly the same. Right? And this is one thing that I was struck by in researching the case even before Chilcot, because the structure of the British intelligence community and the U.S. community are vastly different. Right? One parliamentary system versus presidential system, and a very different relationship between agencies and within government in Britain and the U.S. And yet the story was almost precisely the same. If you go back and you read declassified estimates up to 2002 on both sides, they're both telling the same story about Iraq. Bad country, bad guy, we want to go on a road trip with him, probably has some leftover stuff from the 1980s buried out in the desert, but not a huge imminent threat, and there's a lot that we just don't know. They were very candid about the limits of available knowledge, the CIA as well as British. And that sort of frank admission, that goes away in 2002. They become much more confident and much more certain about the information they're delivering to the White House as well as to
When
Tony
did
Blair.
Colin Powell testify?
So Secretary Powell testified in February 2003, and this was the famous trip before the UN Security Council. And Powell made the case publicly to try to convince the UN to support a resolution against Saddam Hussein, and more broadly just to generate international support for the coming war. What was interesting about Powell's speech, a lot was interesting about it, was a couple of things. One, he used intelligence very cleverly. Right? He, following Blair's example, had set out to release some intelligence, but not all of it. And what he said was, I am going to give you a taste of the intelligence picture. I'm going to give you just a little bit of what I can tell you. Now, the really juicy stuff, the really damning stuff, well, that remains classified. I'm so sorry. Right? This was a really effective tactic that Powell used. Right? The other thing that he did is he brought a friend. He brought George Tenet, who was the director of Central Intelligence and director of Central Intelligence at the time, and Tenet sat right behind him. Right? Didn't say a word, didn't have to. Right? Got up and left after the briefing. Right? But he was on camera. He was in the frame the entire time. You're staring not only at the representative of the administration, but also the leader of the intelligence community, right, who is providing symbolic support for all of Powell's assertions. This had a really powerful public effect. You can measure public opinion before the war in the United States, and there's a big bump in the week after Powell does this. More proof, I think, that intelligence can be really tempting for policymakers who are trying to make the case. The second one was Harold's question about civilian casualties in Great Britain. It's absolutely true. The British public was never on board with this, and they were very tepid about it going in, even after Blair made the case. He got enough support in Parliament to do it, but it was never a popular war. And one of the interesting things that I've been thinking about regarding the Chilcot inquiry is, why is there such intense British criticism of its Iraqi war effort? Because ultimately, at the end of the day, this was a U.S. show, right? The U.S. was going to do this. Blair had the decision about whether or not he wanted to come along, right? But the United States bears the responsibility for this war. And it was our invasion. And yet, I don't sense the same sort of post hoc acrimony in the United States. I think more or less most Americans are over it. Right? We had that debate. It was pretty intense at the time, but we're sort of over it, and we're moving on to new issues. It's not over in Great Britain. It's still incredibly intense, and I was struck by how tangible the arguments still are about British participation in the Iraq War. So I set out asking people, like I did this little terribly unscientific survey while I was over there. I asked everybody I could, from intelligence people, policymakers, and academics, and journalists, and I got a million different answers. Right? One of them was, it had to do with the casualties, that people were still upset, right, by every British death. Another answer I got was that this all had to do with intra-labor politics. So Tony Blair is incredibly unpopular with a large chunk of the Labour Party because they basically feel like he was trying to destroy it from within, make it into a party that wasn't Labour at all. So they view any attempt to keep hammering on Blair for his decisions as productive in returning the Labour Party to Labour and sort of expunging the Blair years from their historical consciousness. Right? And the other big explanation that I heard a lot of was that Blair brought Britain into the war as a junior partner. Right? And there was something about having to do an unpopular war from a position of relative weakness, where once had been the dominant power in international politics, was now forced to go along with a war that it didn't want. Right? So this still lingers as an object of great interest and upset in Britain. Oh, and Jeff's question, could intelligence have stopped the war? No.
Which says a lot.
Which says a lot. I mean, I talk about intelligence policy relations. It's not an equal relationship. It's imbalanced. Right? Policymakers are ultimately the ones that get to decide, not intelligence. And policymakers aren't even obligated to listen to intelligence. Right? There's no legal requirement that you sit and hear a briefing. There's no legal requirement that you read a dossier. If you're prime minister or you're a president, you can get your information and insight from anywhere you want to get it. It can be from intelligence, it can be from your colleagues, it can be from your friends, it can be from your dog. It doesn't matter, right? You've been elected, you're making the choice. Now, for the Bush administration, which was really interesting, I think that a lot of officials within the Bush administration were very skeptical of intelligence coming in, right? In a story that goes back to the 1970s. Not the president himself, but some in the administration were very skeptical about the quality of intelligence from the CIA. And they were quite happy to ignore it and trust their own sources and their own expertise and their own experience. Right? This all changes in late summer of 2002 when suddenly Iraq becomes controversial in the United States. And then the administration starts to lean on intelligence to help it make the case. The other reason that I say that intelligence couldn't have stopped the war is that the information underlying everything was really ambiguous, right? It was partial, it was patchy. You could make a claim that Iraq probably had some latent capability, right? The question was, it's just a matter of interpretation. Does this latent capability represent a threat? Ultimately, that's a political judgment. That's not an intelligence judgment, right? But the problem was that politicians enlisted intelligence to become political actors.
We're going to keep going around the room, and if you're on this side, I'll look back to occasionally catch your eye or your hand up. But I know we have Jack, Thomas, and then Eileen in that order. Jack, you want to?
Ready for me? Yes. To those of us who are old enough to have either lived in or through World War II, did not expect that Joe Blow on the street would know every dotted I or crossed T. There was trust in our government. That's gone. Now, we had some key phrases. One was rhetorical. What's the matter? Don't you know there's a war on? That's right. Yeah, and that's the last one we really won, too, for a postscript. The other thing would be something like this. The Office of Strategic Services. Some people didn't even know what that was, and much less never heard of it. Predecessor to the CIA? Yes, that's right. In fact, there was a movie made circa that time period. I think Alan Ladd was one of those in there, and it was about the only one I can recall that was on the OSS. Mm-hmm. Now, did you have any colleagues, or did you know somebody after the war? No, after the war that was in the OSS? Yes, you might find out that, yes, there was one. A lesser number over in the Far East, when in the centralization over in Europe. Mm-hmm. But then, I remember I wrote a paper in 1970 that did a comparison of state secrets. Take a look at 18 U.S.C. Section 793, that's ours. Now look at the People's Republic of China. Don't look at a title on it. Well, it looks just like ours. And then Russia, it looks just like ours. So we had one commonality there. Shh. And then some of the slogans for buying bonds was, loose lips sink ships. We don't have that anymore. Maybe we'll be much better off if when somebody asks a question or starts a leak, just say, go see a plumber.
Okay, Thomas.
Judge, thank you for your presentation. I have two brief questions. The first one, was there any kind of, what was the state of the cooperation or pushback or exchanges between the British and the American intelligence services on the one hand, and on the other hand, other Western intelligence services which were much more skeptical about what was going on? I'm thinking about the French, the Germans, the Russians also. And the second question, there was this narrative which has often been emphasized by American officials after the beginning of the war, that after the war of 1990-91, we realized that we had badly underestimated the degree of progress of Saddam Hussein's nuclear program. So there was a willingness to make things right. So maybe we would have to doctor intelligence, but there was at least a good justification.
Eileen?
Thank you for speaking, Josh. That was really fascinating. So I'm convinced by your story that secrecy, led to sort of the dumbing down of information and the resulting policy solutions or prescriptions for that. But we can also think of the alternative, right? That and historically, that when secrecy and lack of transparency leads to power being gone unchecked with terrible foreign policy decisions. So the first question is, are the results any different? And then the second question, what stood out to me was more the part about the organizational goals, right? Because the very existence of these organizations relies on threat. With peace, there is no need for them, right? So, are there organizational goals of these secret institutional organizations sort of prone to erring on the side of being mistaken about the size or the amount of threat that we face domestically and internationally?
Great. Thank you. So let me work in reverse order for these questions. I'll start with Eileen's, which is an excellent question. Intelligence organizations are big bureaucracies. Right? Some people sometimes forget this. They're big bureaucracies, and every bureaucracy, public sector or private sector, cares about wealth, autonomy, and prestige. Right? Intelligence officials are not like stoic truth seekers, right? You don't get to run a building that big without being a pretty sharp-elbowed bureaucrat, right? And they are this way. And intelligence organizations do think about their own bureaucratic best interest, even when they're writing estimates and coordinating estimates. Right? We have a long history of this in the United States and elsewhere. I'll give you one example. In the United States, in the early Cold War, the U.S. Air Force constantly exaggerated Soviet capabilities, especially Soviet bomber capabilities. Now, why would the U.S. Air Force constantly exaggerate Soviet bomber capabilities beyond anybody else by a large margin? It's because they wanted their own bombers. Right? So there's always that part of it. Right? The organizations in this story were in a really bad position. Right? They were put in a terrible position for two reasons. One was the boomerang problem you start with, that there's a fear of not having the 1991 experience repeated again. In 1991, it was determined that the intelligence community in the United States had underestimated Iraqi progress on biological, chemical, and nuclear weapons. And so let's err on the side of predicting too much. That could be possible. My argument is that it was exacerbated by the second problem, which was political pressure. Right? So if you're George Tenet or you're a high-level intelligence official, you say, well, one, I don't want to make that mistake again in 91, and I've got policymakers leaning on me to go in that direction, so I might as well just do it. Right? I might as well just do it. Policy pressure and the desire to bring intelligence to the public exacerbated this organizational incentive. Right? Now, again, what's interesting is that if you compare estimates from just even a year earlier, they're very different. Right? So even though the same organizational concern about the boomerang problem existed, the intelligence up to 2002 is pretty good. It's pretty reasonable. Right? There was a lot of doubt and disagreement among agencies, internationally and domestically, but it was pretty reasonable. On Tom's question, you mentioned the boomerang problem, the 1991 thing. It's hard to know exactly what intelligence agencies were sharing with each other, U.S. and U.K., and U.S. and then other intelligence services. We can glean some of this in Chilcot. They released some of the conversations between intelligence officials. The U.S. and Great Britain have long had a very deep and durable intelligence sharing arrangement. Right? Great Britain has largely relied on American intelligence, at least technical intelligence, for a long time. I think what was clear in this case is that U.S. and British intelligence were both largely in the dark on Iraq. Right? and they were both relying on German intelligence for human assets and trying to convince anybody that they could to defect and tell them what was going on in Iraq. They knew very little.
Did we listen to the French at all?
Well, we did. We actually had a pretty long-standing relationship with French intelligence. As far as I can tell in the open sources, French intelligence was a lot more skeptical about what was going on in Iraq. French and German and Russian intelligence. After the war, a lot of observers have said, well, everybody thought that Iraq had these weapons. Even countries who were opposed to the war, France, Germany, Russia. Turns out that I don't think they were convinced of that. Again, this is just reading the open sources. I can't find evidence that this is actually what French intelligence was saying or German intelligence was saying. Right? So, yeah, I know that there were sort of lower level interactions between intelligence analysts working in different countries. It didn't have any effect. Finally, to Jack's question about secrecy more broadly. Right? Not just in the case of a national intelligence estimate or a government dossier, but secret intelligence across the board. I think it's obviously very true that we've become much more transparent. Right? The situation today is not like the situation in the 50s or the 60s or the 70s. If you want, after my talk today, you can go back to your computer and apply for a job with British intelligence. You can go online, learn all about it, and put your name in. You can say that you can do it with CIA, you can do it with the Mossad. You can go into the Israeli intelligence. It's a brave new world. You can go into the Mossad's website and apply for a job. We just have this vast amount of knowledge of these intelligence agencies and what they do and how they're organized that we never had before. Now, my feelings on all of this are mixed. Right? Because on the one hand, I've made an argument today about the dangers of too much transparency, right? And how it affects intelligence judgments and how it actually perverts the public debate. Right? On the other hand, there's a danger in too much secrecy. Intelligence agencies in Great Britain and the United States have a history of bad behavior. Right? They've done really bad, rotten things, and they've shielded themselves behind secrecy. So there's a real trade-off involved here, right? So my general position on this is that in a democracy, the onus is on those who are championing secrecy, right? The default position should be transparency and open. And if you want something to be secret, you have to explain why. I think that in this case, there's a real strong argument for restoring secrecy to the production of intelligence analysis and estimates. Right? That if you make these things public, you not only pervert the quality of intelligence, but you make it very hard for intelligence officials to have candid conversations with their political bosses. In a way, this is a lot like attorney-client privilege or doctor-patient confidentiality. We have these social mechanisms in place so that we can encourage people to have uncomfortable conversations, to say things to each other that they might not say if they were exposed to public view. I think restoring secrecy in this respect is worthwhile, right? To protect the integrity of those discussions and to hopefully protect the integrity of intelligence analysis.
One more question for Rachel. Okay, let's go.
Josh, I just finished reading your book last week. It is an outstanding book. It's very well researched and I think very thought-provoking.
Is everybody listening? Because
It's definitely recommended.
you know, Christmas is coming.
He wants
Question.
5% from your
Fixing the facts.
Fixing the facts. The question I have is so much emphasis is placed upon whether there were weapons of mass destruction. And why was that? Because other countries like North Korea, which is not known for being a very stable country, Pakistan, which is not known for being very friendly to the U.S., these countries had weapons of mass destruction. However, we chose not to take action against them. Why was it that we in the United States, the Bush administration, felt that this was a danger to the United States, much less the other people in the area?
Then do you have an easier question?
Probably it's a little bit peripheral. Could Could you speak to the special relationship with Britain? The British keep saying that they have a special relationship. I think we'd probably be better off if they didn't kind of lapdog and accept everything we did.
Oh, gosh, Ed, can you top that one?
I'll try to top it, but I don't think I will. You mentioned that the organization of the intelligence communities in the United States and in the UK are very different bureaucratically and in their relation to the elected government. I'd like you to delve into that, and I've been particularly sensitive to criticisms that the independence of the U.S. agencies are undermined by the fact that the depth of political appointees is much greater in the U.S. than it is in the UK.
And before we go back to Josh's answers to these questions, I wanted to ask the ambassador if he had any thoughts he wanted to share with us.
Well, just a couple. I was actually one of those people reading the intelligence at the time, and I would see reports, communication intercepts of Iraqi military officers saying to each other, "Be sure you have your gas mask ready because when the fighting starts, you're going to need it." Now, was this a head fake? Was it for real? Or was it simply something that these Iraqi officers also believed at the time because they were being led to believe it? And some of our information also came from Israeli intelligence. And gee, what interest would they have in cooking the books in a way? So there was a whole cascade of tendentious decisions made. I'll also say that on December 12th, 2002, I met with President Bush in the Oval Office, and he said, "Bob, we're fixing to do a regime change in Iraq, and we need your help with the Saudis to make it happen." So he was fixing to do a regime change in December of 2002.
Right. What, December of 2001?
Well, 2001, I'm sorry, 2001.
December of 2001.
2001.
Yeah.
It was 2001.
Yeah. So on that point, he was an early adopter of this, and one thing that comes out in the Chilcot inquiry was that Blair was as well.
Yeah.
Right? This is one of the few things I genuinely learned that's new about this. When I wrote about this in the award-winning and on Amazon.com book, what I knew at that time was that Blair was coming around to the idea in sort of summer, fall 2002. It turns out it's quite clear he was on board from the start. So he was on board late 2001, early 2002. He had made the strategic decision that we're going to make good on our special relationship with the United States. And there's also indications in the book that this wasn't just about supporting the U.S., that he was actually a sort of firm believer in this as well, much more so than he made it seem to be at the time. In terms of all of the intelligence that you're receiving, it's true that as the war approached, especially in the weeks leading up to it, we're getting these weird sort of garbled communications: put on your gas mask, clean up the site, blah, blah, blah. What we know now is that the Iraqi officers had no idea what was going on.
Yeah.
And a lot of them were assuming that Saddam must have some stuff too. Right? A lot of them, I want to be clear, it was not ridiculous to imagine that Iraq had mustard gas buried out in the desert. Like, a lot of people believe that, reasonable people. I interviewed a bunch of weapons inspectors, and they all sort of agreed that, yeah, he's probably got some leftover stuff from the 80s. But the thing was, nobody knew. There wasn't any actual information. Right? The Iraqi officers were guessing as much as anyone else. And this continued even after inspectors were returning and finding a whole lot of nothing. On the other questions, I guess I'll talk about the U.S. and I'll go in reverse order. So on U.S. and British organizational differences and how that manifested, the major difference is that in the U.S. there's been a deliberate effort to detach the intelligence community from policymakers over time. There's a reason why the CIA is in Langley, not in Washington, D.C. Right? There's this argument that in order to ensure analytical objectivity and integrity, you must actually be physically separate from the DC policy fray, right? Or else you'll get wrapped up in it, and you'll politicize every day just because it's a very political town. In Great Britain, you don't have that history. Right? The machinery, I mean, the SIS works for the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. It's built into the machinery of government. So they've never believed in having that separation. In Great Britain, the buffer against politicization has always been the civil service norms. These are career civil service officers. They're removed from the political wing. They don't have that problem. Some American critics, as you mentioned, think that the big problem is the layer of political appointees that has really exploded in the United States over the last 20, 25 years, and that's really made this sort of thing more common and more possible. I'm a little bit skeptical of the argument, just because in my research going back to the 1960s, I'm seeing a familiar pattern. The politicization happens for public reasons. And it really doesn't matter the nature of the organizational design. It doesn't matter how many political appointees you have at any given time. What matters is when policymakers make that key decision that they've got to use intelligence to help make the case. Policymakers are willing to ignore or tolerate intelligence they don't agree with until it threatens them politically. And then all of a sudden you have a real danger. On the special relationship question, well, the first question is there still a special relationship? I don't know. Right? I was asking people that this summer as well, and I got a range of answers. Some said, yes, obviously, we have a long history of shared interests, shared norms, shared values. We fought together over and over again. That means something, right? That means something. We send our students on exchange to the U.S., they drink in your bars. You send us ours, they drink in our pubs. All of them behave badly. But we shall overcome, right? But I also had some other views that said the special relationship is over. The United States and Great Britain are allies. They will work together, but this notion of the sort of deep ideological affinity and commonality of values is just disappearing, if it's not disappeared already. The relationship, according to this view, is going back to sort of a traditional interstate relationship. When interests align, they'll work together. When they don't, they'll deviate. Now, one way to thinking about whether or not this is a good or a bad thing is ask what would you do if you were advising the new Prime Minister? If you were advising Theresa May today, what would you tell her? I think my going in position with Prime Minister May would be, you should hug the U.S. close. You should absolutely hug the U.S. close, right? Even if it means that sometimes you're going to be embarrassed, even if it means that tabloids are going to call you a poodle, just get over it. The United States has the world's most lethal and professional military. The United States has this gigantic nuclear arsenal. The United States has the world's biggest, sprawling, and most effective intelligence apparatus, right? Be friends with that, right? Don't get on the wrong side of the biggest, baddest dude on the block, right? Especially since biggest, baddest dude on the block is searching for friends after the trauma of the last 15 years. Cultivate that. I'd say that Tony Blair wasn't wrong in making that strategic judgment. I think that Blair's big error was that he didn't really take advantage of it. And the Chilcot inquiry in other sections really makes clear that he was mostly concerned with the optics of the war, not the details of the war or the post-war effort. He could have done a lot to really lean on President Bush to prepare for the post-war period, to take seriously the doubters that said this is not going to be a cakewalk, right? And so if you're going to put yourself in that situation, which publicly you're on board as the junior partner in a special relationship, at least take advantage of it behind the scenes. And I don't think that Blair did a very good job of that. And then the last question, why so much concern about Iraqi weapons of mass destruction, where other countries like North Korea with nuclear weapons weren't in our crosshairs? I think there's three reasons for that. The first reason is this terrible acronym WMD. Weapons of mass destruction might be the dumbest phrase in American political life. And the reason is that most of what we call weapons of mass destruction don't actually cause mass destruction. We lump everything under this giant umbrella. Everything from old-fashioned chemical munitions, which aren't going to cause much death or destruction at all, to thermonuclear weapons, which cause lots and lots of death and destruction at orders of magnitude more than other things. And yet we lump these things all together in this very scary phrase. Right? We don't think straight about chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons because we start from the viewing them through the lens of WMD, which scares us. Right? So that's one reason. WMD scared us. Another reason is that we were very concerned with terrorism. 2003, Iraq's in the Middle East. When most Americans think of terrorism, they don't think about Korea, they think about the Middle East. So when the Bush administration tried to float the argument that Iraq was connected to Al-Qaeda, even though it wasn't true, I think it resonated in a way that you just couldn't make that argument with North Korea or anywhere else. It was right in the middle of that bad neighborhood. Therefore, the idea of weapons of mass destruction, that's scary. Terrorism, that's scary. People were willing to give the administration the benefit of the doubt. The third reason why we did Iraq and not North Korea is that North Korea has nuclear weapons. Iraq didn't, right? And it's possible to make the case that we have to get rid of this terrible regime before they acquire these terrible nuclear weapons. We were well past that point when it came to North Korea.
Okay, there's food left over there. You're certainly welcome to stay and have lunch if you didn't get your lunch. But I know every author, speaker wants to speak to a packed house at least once. And they're like, he's got a packed house here, so let's give him a big round of applause. You're welcome to stay. All can eat.
Hello, sir. How are you? Good. We'll see you tomorrow in class. Yeah, exactly.